The night my roommate brought something back. I used to think all that supernatural stuff, ghosts, demons, whatever, was just fantasy. Something people made up to scare themselves for fun. But I've changed my mind since what happened with James. James was my roommate during that one semester when I lived off campus. He was a quiet, outdoorsy guy, loved hiking and finding remote trails. We were different in that way. While he spent his weekends in the wilderness, I was more content with a quiet night at home, playing games or catching up on Netflix. Despite that, we got along fine. At least we did before everything changed. It started the night James came back from a solo hike in a place called Black Pine. You've probably never heard of it. It's this remote, largely unknown forest that's off most people's radar. James was always excited about places like that, locations where you could almost feel like the first person to set foot there. He'd told me about Black Pine before he left. Apparently, there were these strange stone ruins deep in the woods, structures no one could explain. He was fascinated by it, of course. That was the last time I ever saw him excited about anything. He got back late that Sunday, way later than he usually returned from his trips. I was sitting in the living room when I heard him come in, but something felt different. I turned to look at him, and the moment I saw his face, I knew something was wrong. He was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes had this haunted look. Sweat clung to his skin despite the cold night air outside. "You all right?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "Yeah," he muttered, almost as if he didn't hear me. "Just a long hike. Got caught in the rain on the way back. I'm fine." I didn't press him. He was the type who could handle tough hikes, so I figured exhaustion was normal. But there was something else. It wasn't just tiredness. It was like he'd brought back more than just sore muscles and wet clothes. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard something coming from James's room. At first, I thought it was the TV or maybe he was on the phone, but when I listened closely, it was clear that it wasn't either. It was a low whisper, barely audible, but unsettling in its tone. It was rhythmic, like chanting, but in no language I recognized. I paused outside his door, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but something held me back. "James? You okay?" I called out, my voice uncertain. The whispering stopped immediately. There was a long silence before James replied, "Yeah, just meditating." Meditating? At midnight? That wasn't like him, but I let it go. I went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day it got worse. I found James sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly out the window, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug. His face was gaunt, eyes bloodshot like he hadn't slept a minute. I joined him, trying to lighten the mood. "How was the hike?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Finally, after what felt like too long, he spoke, his voice distant. "I had a dream last night. I was back at Black Pine, at those ruins. But they weren't empty. There were figures, tall, dark, covered in these glowing marks. They weren't human, not in any way I've ever seen." A chill ran down my spine. "That sounds like a nightmare, man." "It didn't feel like a nightmare," he said, his eyes never leaving the window. "It felt real. Too real." I didn't know what to say to that. The look in his eyes unsettled me more than his words. It was as if he truly believed what he was saying, that these figures had followed him, or worse, that they were still watching him. Over the next few days, James's behavior grew more erratic. At night, I'd hear him pacing in his room, and sometimes that same unsettling whisper would seep through the walls. During the day, he barely spoke, but when he did, it was cryptic. "They're waiting," he'd mutter. "I shouldn't have gone there." I started to notice physical changes too. He was losing weight fast, his skin taking on a grayish tone. His eyes, once full of life, had become hollow, dark. Whatever was going on inside his head was consuming him. And then there was the smell. It started faint at first, a subtle rotting odor I couldn't place. But within days it became overwhelming, permeating the entire apartment. I searched everywhere for the source, convinced something had died in the walls or under the floorboards, but no matter how hard I looked, I found nothing. And when I asked James if he noticed the smell, he simply shrugged as if it didn't exist. The breaking point came one night when I woke up to a sound in the hallway outside my bedroom. It was a scratching noise, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded as I crept to the door and opened it just enough to peek out. What I saw froze me in place. James was standing in the hallway. James was standing in the hallway, facing the wall. He had something in his hand, a knife, I think, and he was dragging it across the wall, carving symbols into the plaster. They were strange, unfamiliar symbols, like nothing I'd ever seen. And all the while, he was whispering, that same low, guttural chanting. I stood there paralyzed, watching him for what felt like an eternity. Then suddenly he stopped. He turned around slowly and looked straight at me. His eyes, they weren't right. They were black, completely devoid of color, of life. He stared at me, not saying a word, just smiling, a slow, twisted smile that made my skin crawl. Then he turned back to the wall and resumed his scratching. I couldn't stay there any longer. I went back to my room, locked the door, and called the police. I didn't know what else to do. When the officers arrived, James didn't resist. He was eerily calm as they took him away. They sent him to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. I haven't heard from him since. But here's where things get even stranger. A few days after James was gone, I decided to repaint the walls to cover up the damage he'd done. When I started scraping away the old paint, I found something underneath. Symbols. Faint, almost invisible, but unmistakably there, like they had been etched into the wall long before we ever moved in. I moved out the next week. I couldn't stay there anymore. Whatever James had brought back with him from Black Pine, it didn't leave when he did, and I'm not sure it ever will.